somehow to the next slide. There we go. All right. And how many here are developers? We got some. And how many here are frustrated with the layout system? So a lot of people, which is what I expected. It's kind of taking me a while to get to one screen to the other right now. So why is designing layout hard? Grids have always been a problem. As developers, we were handed these shiny comps from our designers that are pretty much impossible to execute perfectly. Why is this? So today I'm going to address this question as well as providing the evolution of solutions developers have come up with. CSS has used layout for web pages, but it doesn't really do a great job. Developers are forced to compromise designs, use hacks. What's that? Okay.
Go. Keep talking.
Yeah.
All right, never mind. All right, go ahead.
And developers, as developers, we're forced to use CSS code that wasn't even intended for layouts. So why has this simple concept become so confusing? I think this is great. CSS hasn't been known for its abilities in handling layouts. Although this has been a problem when CSS first came out, it's evolved to be a pretty common one over the years with all sorts of complex layouts that couldn't be easily implemented. People have been very creative at getting around the lack of support by using floats and absolute positionings, and that a variety of CSS layout frameworks emerged. It's important to explore the history of CSS layout in general to fully understand how CSS grids came to be and what they are today. Next, I'm going to go over what we did without CSS, CSS 1, 2, and 3. Starting in the dark ages, it was a time where we didn't have CSS and the world consisted of tables, spacer GIFs, adding backgrounds required table tags. During this time, we used tables to create layouts. Table rows and columns were primarily used for layout purposes. Next, the W3C came out with an idea and wanted to make lives for developers easier, so CSS was introduced. And here's a quote from Malika. You could control the style of an entire website with just a few lines of code in a single file, and that at the time was totally radical. So it's kind of hard to remember, but there was a time when we didn't have CSS. And but however, CSS 1, we were able to replace that spacer GIF with CSS margins, but CSS 1 didn't have any layout tools. It had width, height, and floats, but they weren't intended for layouts. So CSS 2 was introduced. It promised to finally separate layout from the tags. We could use more appropriate semantic markup, navigation lists could be tabbed, and equal heights columns became something we could do in CSS with the table style value. However, there's a lot of cross-compatibility issues with this. CSS tables were unusable in a lot of browsers. The lack of support and consistency across browsers has kind of become a repeating pattern in the history of CSS grids. Meaning like developers are forced to use these like weird and complicated code just to position things. So CSS 3 in the 2D layout, plagued with ambiguities, standard compliance bugs, and inconsistent behaviors, W3C implemented modularized CSS 3, which is now the standard. Whoop, I'm not going through the slides. Sorry, guys. So that's that one. Where was I? All right, so two-dimensional layouts. Two-dimensional layouts based system is optimized for user interface. In a grid layout model, the children of the grid container can be kind of positioned in arbitrary slots in predefined flexible or a fixed size layout grid. The system of 2D can be expressed in 5 points. Flexible, meaning that it adapts to the screen size gracefully. Powerful, meaning it doesn't constrain the designer, and it's able to provide the layout for the designer envisions. It has to be robust. It doesn't break in different browsers or screen sizes. It needs to be understandable. The code needs to be clean and readable. And it needs to be performant, which means we want to be able to optimize and reiterate without much trouble. These points have kind of become what our grid systems are based off of. So next I want to talk about the fundamentals of grid design. Why do we use it in web design, and where does it come from? Great. So grid-based design is not an idea that originated on the web. It uses one of the oldest and most basic design principles, which is alignment. The grid aligns using invisible vertical and horizontal lines that the various design and content pieces of a web page, magazine, or newspaper are positioned on. We like to order so we can identify patterns so things become easy. We don't want to have a user try to interpret something from a layout. That being said, randomness in chaos and art is nice, but with grid, and web, we want a clear, goal-oriented layout so the user can recognize something and move on. The goal of a grid system is to create hierarchy, and we want the user to know exactly what the point of the page is as quickly as possible and not to get bogged down with any unnecessary information or structure. So a grid, even if it's not visible, should provide the viewer with a way to navigate content visually. So next, I want to talk about negative space and asymmetric design. Negative space can be described as the power of nothing in design. It can be used to draw the attention to a message or a theme by adding to its impact. It may be tempting to fill in every space with pixels, and I'm sure we all have people thinking, oh, why is this space empty? And designers are always clashing, like, no, it needs to be empty, and it's a little crazy. But when negative space is used in design, it sends signals to the brain that the space is interrupted, and therefore every element around that has the eye drawn towards it. So this is a great example of negative space being used. Your eyes drawn to Chanel and the woman, even though there is a big negative space. Grids can also be asymmetrically balanced, as this image also shows above. Visually, we can create unequal weights on each side of the composition because one side might be more dominant than the other. Asymmetrical design is more dynamic and interesting because it offers more visual variety, although it can be difficult to achieve because the relationships of the elements are a little more complex. So print and web design. In print design, you have everything you need. You know the size of the page, you know the amount of content it has, you know the font and sizes, and making tweaks and adjustments, they're always super easy to do. And when you're done, what you see is what you get. There's no pushing it out towards the web. And in the end, the designer pretty much has full control. But web design, it gets more complicated. Browsers render fonts differently. We have to consider different resolutions, aspect ratios, screen sizes, dynamic content, including different languages. We pretty much need to deal with content that we don't control, but we have to style. And people want content to adjust to their needs. They want an article to be just as legible on their desktop than they do on their phone. So grid systems provide a fast and easy way to create layouts using CSS. They do this by using tested and optimized code. A grid usually provides you with columns and rows to code with, but it's not easy, and coding a grid is complicated. As many developers, we want and we need to get things done really fast. A grid framework can help us out with that. It provides us with pre-packaged code we can use again and again for each project we create. So grid frameworks, in the end, they increase productivity, providing pre-packaged code. So this is just a quick overview of grids. So again, this grid system is set in vertical and horizontal lines in which cells can be arbitrarily positioned on. Lines can be given names in which they can be referenced in CSS. A cell is where the horizontal and vertical tracks meet, and an area is a rectangular shape that spans across one or more cells. These can be named and referenced in CSS. The key to a framework is the separation from layout and markup. It should be completely defined in the CSS, as it allows you to optimize the markup for accessibility without compromising the design. The grid should leave markup somewhat lighter and easier to understand, therefore making it easier to maintain. So next, I want to talk about some major grid frameworks. There's currently hundreds of frameworks out there. They all have their own methods, pros and cons. But for the next few, I picked out because I felt that they had fundamental ideas in the evolution of the CSS grid. So I'm going to talk about the 960, Bootstrap, Flexbox, and Suzy, as well as future grid systems. And I'll also be including any major and central ideas to the CSS grid. So starting with the 960 grid and grid basics by Nathan Smith. So starting with the 960 grid, it was a fixed 12, 16, or 24 grid, which featured source ordering. It was a simple way to lay out websites using the 960 pixel wide grid. 960 being used because it's that number makes a lot of clean divisions when you consider margins and column widths. It was really easy to use. In the 12-column version, column sizes started at 60 and ended at 940. So to create a layout, you'd simply match the class to your div. So for example, grid 1 being 60, grid 2 being 140, and then all the way to the grid 12 being, that should be grid 12, grid 12 being 940. These would all be contained in a 12-column div container to make sure that the proper classes are being referred to. Next, I want to talk about push and pull. The 960 allowed for this, and this was great for repositioning elements independently. Pushing and pulling keeps markup clean. A great way of using, or a great example of a push and pull is repositioning a logo, which might be one of the most important items on the page. And although a designer might want the logo in the middle of the page or something, developers, we want it semantically first. So with push and pull, we can achieve this. And this is great for our fellow humans who use screen readers, so they don't have they're not reading an article and have a logo in the middle of their page there. There's also prefix and suffix. We can create space in our grids. This is attuned to, I didn't go to the next page. This is a lot like negative space in grid design. And how they're used is very similar to the push and pull classes. They're effectively, they create negative space and leave blank space before an element using prefix and after using suffix. So in this example, I have grid 6, suffix 2, leaving 2 spaces after. It's pretty easy. Next is alpha and omega. So you use these when you have nested items, and you'll be able to apply these to grid units that are the children of grids. The alpha class is applied to the first child and the omega to the last. And these provide a margin fix so we can nest grid units inside of another unit. Okay, so the next major grid framework I want to talk about is Bootstrap and the implementation of responsive design. So 960 didn't comply with the core CSS3 values I mentioned before about 2D layouts because it wasn't responsive. So Bootstrap was introduced as a sleek and powerful mobile-first framework for faster and easier development. It was developed by Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton at Twitter. Hence, it used to be called Twitter Bootstrap. I think it's just called Bootstrap now. Bootstrap solved many problems. It's easier to use, but it's cross-compatible. It responds to the device. And I think this is the biggest jump, but biggest point, but it separates styles for viewports consisted in one file instead of being separated. So in the past, websites were designed to fit well on a standard desktop screen. However, when mobile devices hit the market, the landscape changed quite a bit, and we needed to create content that fit into an array of different screen sizes. Ethan Marcotte coined the term responsive web design from a list apart. And he described how the design landscape was rapidly changing with the introduction of mobile devices. And he proposed that we needed to create flexible and fluid web design. So Bootstrap, at its core, is responsive and mobile first. It has clearly defined breakpoints for different kinds of devices using media queries. In the past, we had to adapt websites to sizes differently. Each size would have a completely different CSS style sheet, whereas Bootstraps are contained in all-in-one source. Bootstrap has 4 major breakpoints. Extra small, which that includes the concept of mobile first. This covers most cell phones. Small, which covers most tablets. Medium is desktop, and large, which covers most widescreen monitors. I just want to say that although Bootstrap was developed in 2011, it's still a preference for many developers today. And I think it's because it's updated and it's actually currently in its 3rd version, I think. There's also Flex and SAS versions out there of it. In my opinion, I think it's good for smaller size projects that aren't using pixel perfect design, but really at its core, it's just a shiny new 960 grid. So
or as we say at work, fucking Bootstrap.
Fucking Bootstrap. I did mention Flexbox a little bit, and so what about Flexbox? I kind of had a hard time fitting into the timeline, but I think it fits appropriately here. So what's Flexbox? It's a grid-based layout module that was created in order to arrange elements in an efficient way on the page. Flexbox items are directed, aligned, ordered, and flexible. Elements are designed to best fill the space on the container grid. And a quote from Rachel Andrew, grid layout for the main page structure of rows and columns, Flexbox for UI elements, anything you could linearize. So in 2011, a working draft of Flexbox was published. It was created by Firefox to create its own UI, but it was thought to be helpful for web pages as well. And there were two translated versions, CSS and WebKit. Two translated versions, WebKit and Firefox, which kind of ended up creating a ton of divergent details, and even basic components weren't working correctly. They were very different. So in 2011 and 2012, the Flexbox spec was taken over by Tab Atkins and became a W3C candidate recommendation. And this meant that the spec was stable, supported in browsers, kind of, and tests were being written. And tests were being written for it. The spec would be continually revised for the next few years to tighten its algorithm and increase efficiency. Today, the Flexbox is still a candidate recommendation. It was last worked on in 2015 and is classified as a draft document. A draft document means that it may be updated, replaced, or obsolete by another document at any time.
Awesome.
Although Flexbox can solve many layout problems, it just lacks too much support and consistency. And this is another quote by Rachel Andrew. It should be, oh, I am not changing these. Sorry, guys. That should be Rachel Andrew. I think this quote just summed up Flexbox perfectly. So Flexbox is for one-dimensional layouts, anything that needs to be laid out in a straight line or in a broken line, which would be a single straight line if they were joined back together. Grid is for two-dimensional layouts. It can be used as a low-powered Flexbox substitute. We're trying to make sure that a single column row grid acts very similar to Flexbox, but that's not using its full power. So that sums it up pretty well. So next, I want to talk about Suzy and Sass. So relying on Bootstrap and 960 is you're kind of putting yourself in a position where you're using really heavy, pre-formatted, markup-intensive code, and it's kind of a burden. So Miriam Suzanne created Suzy, and he put it as to build your own damn grid system. The idea behind Suzy is that it's not exactly a grid system, but more of a toolkit. Suzy provides the tools. You build your own. You build your own damn grid system, actually. In past grid systems, you could only write classes, and there was no way to write tools because that's all the CSS could handle. But and customization is very hard, and you're limited to what the system gives you. Suzy uses a mix-in scheme that applies to a specified amount of columns to any element based on the total columns available. Instead of using classes that need to be added to the HTML, you can immediately target any CSS class and apply a grid to it. So when you first start using Suzy, you need to edit your settings, which I have displayed right up here. And you can do that by declaring the Suzy map. And instead of doing all the math and calculating the pixels and percentages, which I'm not even going to pretend I understand, Suzy can do this for you. And it's pretty easy. You just use an @include and you say span 8, and then that will cover 8 whatever is based off of in your map. It's awesome. It creates exactly what you need without having to do any of the calculations. So next, talk about asymmetric grids, which, if you remember at the beginning of my presentation, was a key design element in grid design. And Suzy is able to handle these. So asymmetric design, I believe, was first used in Singularity, but I feel like it's more fleshed out in Suzy. Suzy allows you to create grids easily with different columns and different sizes. And you can tell Suzy the number of columns and the ratio sizes with the SAS list. For example, if you have a column that is twice the width of a sidebar, you would just represent that with a 2-to-1 list. So I have that example up there. Instead of saying the content is 8, we could just say the content is 1, span 1, and Suzy knows the size of the column if you just provide the location. So content, just span 1. Only that, please. So next, let's talk about grid systems of the future. And W3C is currently working on a browser-based grid, and it's currently in that awesome draft document status that Flexbox is in. But like Flexbox, the CSS grid has powerful abilities to control the sizing and positioning of elements. However, it is a single-axis oriented, meaning it's not optimized for 2D layouts. And it also works in the absence of content structure, making it incredibly fluid. Developers can adapt their layout for any screen size without altering the HTML semantics. The grid layout controls the layout of the content through the use of a grid, the grid items, and grid areas. Items are positioned using an X and Y into slots, or grid areas automatically, or through grid placement properties. The grid container provides settings for all the parameters at once. Grid layout is fixed, flexible, and content-based, unlike Suzy, which is not content-based. Many of the features, or a little bit, but many of the features are analogies and improvements on past frameworks. So grid layout features positive, forward, negative, backwards, similar to the push and pull aspects. So in the end, all these frameworks are still causing problems. So I was wondering what frameworks you guys use. Are you guys familiar with the new CSS browser-based grid coming out? Just wanted to get your ideas and thoughts.
Fucking Bootstrap.
Yeah, so Bootstrap is, I know that we're kind of using it at Pega. We're trying to evolve into more of a Suzy-based system. We have a ton of problems with alignment. Backgrounds are never matching up, and vertical and horizontal alignment is sometimes just the biggest problems. I don't know if anybody else has experienced these issues, but.
And that's probably the biggest reason why sometimes that's a solution is to not use a huge order framework and just roll your own, just build whatever you actually need.
Exactly. So grid systems of the future, you'll probably be making your own damn grid system, like Miriam, Suzanne said, but also it'll be more browser-based, so we're not going to run into all these problems that we have with Suzy too.
So who here has actually remembers using 960? Do you remember how awesome it was when it first came out? And how easy it was to figure out, oh yeah, you just push a little bit, pull a little bit. It was really nice Exactly. Like it was before web design was a thing. And so, you know, in 2012, when I was writing about grid systems, 960 was one of the ones I wrote about because like it wasn't like really too much of a thing to do responsive design yet. And then Bootstrap came out, and it was the new hotness, and Foundation came out, and it was the new hotness. And I think at a certain point, we were actually talking about like throwing 960 into Drupal, like into the core theme in Drupal. So it's interesting to see how grid systems have evolved over time, and also how, you know, today's new hotness is going to be tomorrow's laughing stock. Because right now, Bootstrap is fucking Bootstrap. Like, it's really annoying to use in production. What are, I think you had a thought.
I think Bootstrap is helpful, but a lot of the grid kind of seems weirder on smaller devices. Why should my display on mobile have 12 columns to it?
Exactly.
Figure out, well, I want one column when my monitor is this big, and I need 12 when it's this, when this really should just be one column. And this, 12 or however many, but so when you get a system like Bootstrap is helpful, but it's also limiting in that way where you have to, well, mobile I want 12 columns, and tablet I want 6 columns. So it's very
And Foundation is a similar way. The other thing that I hate about that's fine. Other people can use it. My voice is loud, so I'm sure it'll be on the recording. Yeah, exactly. I was a theater major. I know how to project. My feeling with Foundation was the same way. And then the other thing that happens with these frameworks that annoys the living hell out of me is that you need like 4 divs to just get to the content because of the layout. Like, why do and it's really difficult to get Drupal to do that, which is one of the reasons why we keep having like, you know, and we have just bizarre nitpicky stakeholders that have grown up to believe that that UX means print design that somehow gets turned into an application. So we end up getting an email saying, this is off by 10 pixels. Like, can you fix that?
My ruler told me so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like we have so much design by Hippo that I'm still trying to fight through. And most of that is Bootstrap. If you're trying to get like views to work, why do you need a container and then a row? And then another row, and then a column. Like, you know, what is all of that? What I'm liking about Suzy as a concept is exactly that idea. Like, it's a lot of weird math to parse in your head.
But you don't have to. Yeah. No. Let Suzy or whatever is powered with, let it do the hard stuff.
But what's interesting though is even when you're using like Bootstrap or Foundation, you're still doing crazy math in your head because how do you connect in your head that this device that is really, it's just going to stack everything to one column on a mobile because that's just how it goes. So why exactly is it that that's 12 columns and not one column? So like you have to do this weird inverse math in your head, and it feels like opposite day when you're trying to like design something.
That's precisely why the system that we're switching over to doesn't use 12 columns, it uses ratios. I want this to go 100% of the space available, half the space, a third of the space. You know, how often do we have design that takes up 11 columns and has one extra column on the side? Seriously, versus we could say, all right, this is, you know, our layout's divided into quarters or thirds, you know, 1/3, 2/3, whatever it might be. He just keeps things simple and you still can get the same kind of quality design.
Yeah.
So the margins, if you're doing all the ratios,
Gutters, right now we're using fixed gutter sizes. So you can say, oh, this particular grid is using, our default gutter size, or this one gets double that default, or, quadruple or half that. They're not fluid gutters, mind you, but it still keeps your content and your grids and your subgrids
it keeps all of your columns and your gutters lined up.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I hear clapping in the other room.
So that I think I want some clapping. I don't know.
Yeah, so it suggests that we should also clap.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, and I think it's time to set up. What's the next session, Bootstrap? Colleen.
Thank you.
So, CSS Explorer. Okay, perfect. We're in the red center. Okay, perfect. More grids. More grids. More grids. Grids of the future.
Is it?
Suzy based theme on Drupal. Is that Suzy's based theme on Drupal?